You're watching Strat News Global. I'm Amitabh Brevi, and joining us from Berlin is Theodore Murphy. He's the Director of Africa with the European Council on Foreign Relations. Theo, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Amitabh. Good to be with you.
Just wanted your analysis of the situation in Ethiopia, and for those who are looking at it from outside, it seems quite ironic and deadly ironic in terms of a peace prize laureate, the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, waging war within his own country and forcing maybe the Nobel Peace Prize Committee to do what it very rarely issue some kind of a statement on the situation.
Yeah, the situation there is really disturbing. I think from the perspective of regional stability, but also the terrible humanitarian consequences. The background to it is that Ethiopia has been undergoing a process of transition for the last 2 years. There was a protest that resulted under the leadership of the last prime minister, and that brought the current prime minister, Abiy, to power. He made a lot of initial gestures which encouraged the Nobel Committee to award him the Peace Prize, most notably the agreement with his neighbor Eritrea to put an end to that war. And that, these were some sort of quick successes at the beginning that raised his profile. He also adopted a language and a narrative of very constructive, of sort of peace, of brotherly love, of wanting to bring the region together. But while that has been going on, there's been difficulty, I think, in translating that rhetoric into concrete actions for addressing the deep-seated challenges that Ethiopia faces. Ethiopia is one of the biggest countries in Africa, 110 million people, and it's made up of distinct ethnic blocs who then sort of together constitute the Federation of Ethiopia. Each of these blocs has a great deal of autonomy, and there's even the option for some of them to vote to leave the country, to sort of have an organized secession. What's going on right now is the conflict between the central government, led by Abiy, and the Tigray region. So the Tigray region is one of these ethnic sort of federal blocs, but it's a special one because it is constituted by the former leadership of the country. So Abiy has replaced the leadership of Tigray, the TPLF, and this created a whole nother set of tensions and dynamics that have now spiraled out into the conflict. The TPLF controlled not just its region, but controlled a lot of the federal government reserves. They had control of the security architecture, some of the finances as well. Abiy has tried to take that away from them so that the government would again be and not just for a certain part, but there was a certain tension there. The most proximate cause of the breakout of the conflict was the decision by Abiy to delay the national elections. Exactly. There was already some tension with Tigray. They in Tigray took this as a sign that Abiy intended to extend his rule outside of the constitutional limits. And what they did in Tigray is said, okay, if you are going to not hold elections, we will no longer consider you legitimate because you have no basis in constitutionality. And at the same time, we will also hold our own elections so that we will be legitimate, at least in the eyes of our own people. Then following that, in the fall, there started to be a discrete buildup of military forces, some from the federal government side in Ethiopia, also some reports from the neighbor Eritrea, which has no love also for this Tigray region. So there was a sort of pincer movement coming in. And then on 4th November, this exploded into open conflict.
Now, what's making it even more difficult is the fact that there's virtual communications blackout, the internet or other communication lines. So there's claim and there's counterclaim. The latest, of course, is with the Tigrayans saying that they've destroyed a whole mechanized core of the Ethiopians. That's making it even more difficult in gauging the situation and as you pointed out earlier, the humanitarian crisis that's following from it.
Yeah, that's right. It's very difficult to figure out the balance of the forces on the ground. The Tigrayan forces themselves, even without the federal government, they had under their control quite substantial resources. Then in the first attack of the war, it's quite possible that the TPLF, the Tigrayan forces, were able to seize substantial material from the Ethiopian federal government, because the Ethiopians' northern command, which is on the border of Tigray, was very well outfitted in parallel with the challenge that they saw there from Tigray. So if they managed to seize a lot of those resources, they would be very well positioned. At the same time, even though information is hard to come by, it does seem like the federal government is making advances quickly, more quickly than expected. Let's put it that way. They seem to have taken back a lot of territory and are just held up around the regional capital of Tigray, a place called Mekelle. Coming to the humanitarian consequences, one of the most worrying aspects is this isn't just a battle right now between the federal government and a region. It's also brought in paramilitary forces, which are very ethnically constituted, from another neighboring region. This is from the Amhara. So they're fighting alongside formal federal government troops against the Tigrayans. And once this kind of thing, once the genie is out of the bottle in respect to ethnic tensions and the government using ethnic proxy militias, there's really a tendency in the region for these kind of dynamics to spin out of control. So that's something we need to have an eye on.
Fact that is already being talked about, potential war crimes, potential genocide, ethnic cleansing. You talked about the Moros, the Amharas, the Tigrays itself. That's extremely worrying as well, especially since there is very little independent verification of what's going on.
That's right. That's right. I think there's now substantial refugee flows leaving from Tigray over to Sudan. So let's border each other. And probably, some of the first and best reports will come from people interviewing these refugees who have crossed the border. There's a lot of worrying signs, but I think it's important, when we are looking at terminology and terms like and whatnot,
sure.
That you be exact and there be a sort of judicial standard applied to these.
You are again pointing out, even though the Ethiopian Federal Army may be making progress faster than expected, that the region is extremely destabilized. The pincer movement that you talked about from Eritrea. Eritrea has a traditional enmity with both the Ethiopians and the Tigrayans. Sudan, you pointed out. Somalia, I think the NSA from Ethiopia has also traveled there. The AU has been involved in terms of setting up 3 ex-presidential presidents to try and mediate, which has been rejected. So international mediation so far has been rejected?
I think there's 2 things. The federal government has been calling this a law enforcement action.
Yeah.
And that connotes that it is not a political problem. So if you have a law enforcement action, you don't necessarily need mediation. And I think that's one of the signals that's being sent. In terms of the regional dynamics, it's true that in the past, Ethiopia and Eritrea had poor relations, but that has really changed in the last years. And we see now a sort of axis of alignment between Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia. So this is a new kind of regional constellation that works very well together. Sudan is an important player in this whole issue because the Tigrayans, if they're going to continue the fight, they will need to have international access. And they will not be able to get it from Eritrea, since they're clearly on one side. Sudan does not want to be sucked into this conflict, but I think it will have a very difficult time avoiding being a kind of staging ground of sorts. The refugee population will be there. As we know in the past, connections between refugees and insurgent groups are difficult to cut. The second thing is there's a long history of the local ethnic groups who straddle the border between Sudan and Tigray being active in various kinds of smuggling. So for them, that's another opportunity to ply their trade. The customer has changed, the situation has changed, but they know what they need to do. There will be a demand in Tigray for supplies, and Sudan will be some kind of a corridor. And finally, Sudan itself is going through a complex transition. It has a sort of multi-headed government, which makes it very difficult for it to always act in a coherent picture to the outside world of its actions. And given these other, tension points with the refugees and the smuggling over Sudanese territory, this is a recipe for some possible misunderstanding to occur. I think the Ethiopians know very well that Sudan plays a decisive role, and they will be hoping that Sudan will act responsibly. I'm sure Sudan will also want to act responsibly. The question is whether it will be able to be fully in control of all of its apparatuses of the state, and whether the local dynamics in the east of Sudan, bordering on Tigray, will be fully under Sudan's control. And I think that will not be possible. And as such, the potential for misunderstanding to arise is high.
You talked about how Prime Minister Abiy is portraying this as a law and order issue. Hence, there's no need for mediation since he looks at it as a political, not a political issue, but it's clearly not that. Do you see the transition in the US, say, in terms of the government there, having something to do with the timing of when he started this? I guess what I'm looking at is what is the US doing or will do, and what's Europe doing? I believe Germany is given some kind of aid to the Tigrayans, but apart from that,
I think that the U.S. timing does play a role in the decision making of the various actors of the region. I think it's quite clear that the new administration in the U.S. will take a tougher position vis-a-vis Addis Ababa on this. There has been a lot of understanding from the previous administration for Abiy's line, and the initial signals coming out of the new figures in the U.S. administration seem to indicate that they will be taking a stricter line in terms of international law, but also in terms of holding both parties to account. You would ask before about mediation, and this connects back to that point as well. You can take a position that a mediation is a service for the parties to use, but it can only work when both parties want it. Or you can take a more proactive stance, which says mediation is essential because the parties cannot resolve it themselves. Second, because it's a political problem, not a law enforcement problem. And then the question becomes about how do we make this mediation effective? So how do we get the parties to the table rather than saying, the mediators are waiting here whenever you are ready. And I think we're in the new US administration, we're moving more towards that kind of approach. How do we get a mediation moving even when the parties are not completely ready to accept it?
But until that happens, how do you see the situation? Even if the Ethiopian, the federal army reaches some of the objectives, if not all, the Tigrayans, as you pointed out, have a history of, armed struggle or weaponry or training. Plus, the mountainous terrain could prolong this for a long time.
Yeah, I think, long story short, it's difficult to win a war against the Tigrayans in the sense that the problem will just disappear and the territory will be pacified. They may lose control of the major centers, the major urban centers, but that just means that they would, change to a different form of warfare. And the territory around there, highlands and mountainous, they have a lot of experience fighting in it as a guerrilla movement. And so the change to an insurgency type of war rather than a kind of ground war where you hold your territory would seem to be the logical conclusion. The second question is, if you want to then, as the federal government in Ethiopia, continue as if the problem is gone, how will you administer this region?
Yeah.
The leadership there may not be perfect, but I think it has some kind of public support or popular support. What we're seeing now is that some civil servants are being brought from the ethnic region, from the Amhara region, and given the heightened tensions that are already there between those groups, I really wonder what kind of message that will send to the people who have first now experienced a very aggressive military campaign. Second, we'll see that maybe the federal government is not legitimate because it has pushed its elections where they have held theirs. And now third, that same federal government seems to be aligning with another ethnic group who they're not completely comfortable with and bringing them to govern them. I'm not sure that that's going to work out so well.
On a different note, you're mentioning Sudan and the multidimensional transition that it is going through. The news that came out of Moscow with President Putin announcing a draft agreement for Red Sea port there for the Navy. How do you see that in the whole great game that's being played in Africa between the big powers?
Well, the Red Sea has become an area of a very high value port real estate. That's a trend that's already started, I would say, about 3 or 4 years ago. To be honest, the Russians are latecomers to this game.
Yeah.
And there are other players such as the Emirates, but also the Chinese and of course the US, as well as Turkey, who are far ahead and who have established footholds in different places along the way. Russia is really actually the last, I would say, of the great powers to establish some kind of a port. The second thing to say about it is, even though it's officially a done deal in the news, there are some parts of the Sudanese government who are claiming that it isn't actually a done deal. So I think we need to watch that space a little bit more. We can only infer what Russia's interest is. We've seen that I think they want to be just have some kind of a foothold where everybody else does. That's one. Second, they do have some military connections going through Sudan, but also onwards to Central African Republic. And it may be interesting for them to be able to have some kind of a supply route there. Others who are interested in the port real estate, others than Russia, really see this as having an economic benefit. I don't see that the Russians have been able to connect up the Horn of Africa and their own economic interests. So my analysis is that this is first and foremost about being there, so about flying the flag, and about having some kind of military supply line as well in terms of their interests further inside Africa. But I don't think, like the Chinese, this can be part of a bigger, global economic supply chain like the Belt and Road Initiative.
You mentioned the UAE, but that was in connection to Sudan. But the UAE's involvement in the region and accusations that say drones from Assad were being used from Eritrea in the Ethiopian conflict as well. The outside powers who are involved, it's not just a question of the surrounding countries being, drawn into the conflict.
No, that's right. And I spoke earlier about a kind of axis within the Horn of Africa that spans from Eritrea, Ethiopia to Somalia. These countries all have a very good relationship with the UAE, also with Saudi Arabia. We should keep in mind to work well together. The UAE tends to be a little bit more activist, and the Saudis a bit more of bringing a heavier weight and gravitas and strategy to it. So I think the Emiratis can really play a role in stabilizing the situation if they act wisely. It's true that there's news about their drones being deployed from the Assad base in Eritrea, but also I think just the day before yesterday, a statement came out from the UAE which called very clearly for there to be mediation between both sides, and I think we should choose to interpret that as a positive sign. And in the absence of other signals coming out of Abu Dhabi, I think let's try to amplify that message and hope that the Emiratis can bring the weight that they have to bear behind a possible political solution.
Theodore Murphy, again, appreciate both your time and your insight. Thank you so much for joining us on Strat News Global.
My pleasure, anytime.
Just for our viewers, a reminder that you can support our kind of journalism by going to our website. Do follow our social media handles on Twitter, on Instagram and Facebook. You've been watching Strat News Global. I'm Ahmed Abrevi.